Q&A session on the Simplified Procurement Regulations. I am Tamara Roy, Head Corporate Communications, and I will be your moderator for today's session. We are extremely pleased that you're able to join us today. In the room with me are our Chairman and Procurement Regulator, Ms. Beverly Khan, who will address you briefly before the session begins, followed by two presentations, which will be conducted by Ms. Pastora Brown, our Head Procurement Policy Development, and Mr. Aleem Bash, Head ICT. To support the Q&A segment, we have our Head of Legal, Ms. Lindy Ann Mitchell, and her support team who will also assist. Before we begin the formal aspects of today's proceedings, please allow me to go through some helpful tips for a successful session. Do note that your mics will be muted for the session. Any questions that arise can be sent in the chat option on the Teams platform. These questions will be collated by our team and addressed in the Q&A segment after the presentation. The OPR has received questions prior to the session, so we will address those first before addressing the questions in the chat. Please keep your contributions helpful and be considerate to our presenters and other participants. Do note that this session is being recorded and will be shared via email and uploaded to our website. So without further delay, please welcome Ms. Beverly Khan.
Thank you, Tamara, and good afternoon to all permanent secretaries, deputy permanent secretaries, chief executive officers, heads of the various departments, named procurement officers, staff of procurement units, staff of legal departments throughout public bodies. I too want to add my thank you to joining us today for this Q&A session on the Simplified Procurement Regulations, which came into effect on April 5th, 2024. This morning, we had a similar session to the one that we are now commencing with you. We had over 400 participants, and my understanding is that we have about 130 participants in this current session. We expect a lot more persons to join. So it has been 1 year since full proclamation of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Act, which was fully proclaimed on April 26, 2023. Since then, here at the OPR, we have seen a lot of public bodies finding difficulty, challenges with coming to terms with the requirements of the new system. And we here at the OPR have been focused on guiding you along, building capacity where we can, and really assisting you to become compliant with the Act. Everything that we do is geared towards ensuring compliance with the objects of the Act, and you all know what they are. They speak to transparency, accountability, integrity, value for money, public confidence, local industry development, fairness and equity in how we conduct our public procurements, as well as to the ultimate goal of sustainable development. And therefore, everything that we do in relation to public procurement must be grounded in the objects of the Act. So in the year since full proclamation, hearing the concerns, listening to our stakeholders, and the difficulties that they were encountering, we, in collaboration with the Ministry of Finance, undertook to discuss the issue of simplifying and creating greater flexibility for our public bodies. But I would hasten to add that in simplifying and in providing greater flexibility, the intent is never to remove the oversight responsibility, the regulatory authority of the OPR. If we as a country are to really build a system over time, we must adhere to what the legislative framework requires us to adhere to. So yes, there have been challenges, and yes, we will overcome them. The OPR will assist where we can. In some instances, we have a direct role. In other instances, we believe we have a strong advocacy role to get the changes. But of course, moving into a new system like this one is a significant change. It is a change that has brought a lot of disruption. But it is in the face of these disruptions and this discomfort, we will find the opportunity to build a better system. So the new simplified procedures, after much collaboration with the Ministry of Finance and going through the process with the Legislative Review Committee, we thankfully had approval to begin implementation on April 5th this year. The new simplified procurement regulations gives public bodies a significant degree of flexibility to conduct their procurements. But with that flexibility comes a tremendous amount of responsibility as procurement officers, as accounting officers, for us to ensure that at no time do we go into a state of non-compliance with the Act and engage in activities that are a direct breach of the legislative framework. So you would see, I would urge all of you as you listen to today's presentation to ask questions, to seek clarification as you require. We took about a month to get to you because we wanted to ensure that public bodies had the opportunity to read the regulations, to read it not more than once, actually, because you'll never get the full grasp of it by reading it once. You'll have to read it several times and see how it applies in your specific situations and the different kinds of procurement activities that you are involved in. And therefore, having gone through that process, the OPR is here today to guide you through, to provide the clarifications that you require, and to let you know how the system will evolve in the next few months. When you read the regulations, you would see that there are several instances that refer to guidelines being developed. The OPR is tasked in giving you the greater flexibility. It gives us at the OPR more responsibility, right? Because as the regulatory body, we have to ensure full compliance with the Act and with the regulations. So we are in the process of preparing a handbook and guidelines for all of those instances, and then how you approach all of the regulations. So that is going to be forthcoming very, very soon. In the meantime, there's a lot of in terms of what is required in the Act, that we believe that today we will help to clarify in your own minds the challenges that you are foreseeing, that you have, that you are anticipating, having seen the regulations for a month now. Our intent, as you know, the new public procurement regime is really a decentralized approach. And this new set of regulations, simplified as they are, is really in keeping with that strategy of decentralizing to you. And as I said, in simplifying it to you, there is a tremendous responsibility that now resides with accounting officers, and procurement officers, and the named procurement officer to ensure that you adhere to the Act. In this new simplified regime, the Office of Procurement Regulation maintains its regulatory oversight. We maintain responsibility for receiving reports on your contract activities and several other requirements that the Act requires us to adhere to. And all in the interest of transparency and accountability and achieving value for money. So that always I would urge all public bodies, as you seek to continue to undertake your public procurements, that you always keep in mind the objects of the Act, and you always keep a record of your procurement proceedings, and to show in those procurement proceedings and that file that indeed that you have taken into consideration, or that you continue to be guided, I would say, by the objects of the Act. That is the only way that we will cause this system to take root and to work to the benefit of all of us here in Trinidad and Tobago. So thank you very much for attending, and I will pass you back on to the Head of Corporate Communications, Ms. Roy.
Thank you so much, Ms. Khan. So we'll go straight into our presentations. We will start with Ms. Pastora Brown, who will take you through the Simplified Procurement Regulations 2024.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Good afternoon, everyone. So I will just jump off from where the chairman would have started her opening remarks. So we will speak directly to these regulations. As long as I can get the slides to cooperate. There we go. Right, and so we begin. These regulations. The Simplified Procurement Regulations, as we are aware, refer to procurements that do not exceed $1 million, inclusive, of course, of taxes, duties, and other charges. These regulations contain a lot of information and guidance to assist the public body with its procurements at this lower threshold. So for example, you will see the regulations contain a definition of emergency. This is something we had not had before, but it is now contained in these regulations so that the public body can be appropriately guided in planning its procurements and in planning for its procurements. The regulations also demonstrate that under simplified regulations, we have thresholds. One threshold takes us up to $75,000, and that is referred to in the regs as micro procurements. And between 75,000 and up to 1 million, those are referred to in the regulations as small scale procurements. And as you go through the regulations, you will recognize that they are regulations that are general and apply to simplified, meaning both micro and small scale. And they are those that are specific to micro alone and those that are specific to small scale alone. The regulations also address the issue of time limits for suppliers and contractors to make their submissions and provide some minimum timelines. The regulations go on to define the role of the named procurement officer and the accounting officer, or any person delegated by the accounting officer with respect to simplified procurements. These regulations outline the requirements for suppliers and contractors to be registered. And for micro procurement, this will be registration in the public body's registry. So that registry is, or register is maintained by the public body. But for small scale procurements, the regulations speak to the requirement for suppliers and contractors to be registered in the procurement depository that is maintained by the OPR. The registration, these regulations also introduce a new procurement method called direct contracting, and we will discuss that a little more. These regulations reinforce as an offense splitting of procurement. So you will see where the regulation, first of all, demonstrates how does the public body estimate the value of its procurement, and then it speaks to the fact that public bodies shall not split their procurements to enjoy the flexibilities that will be provided within a lower threshold. So for example, if when you estimate your procurement, let's say for the year or for 3 years, if that is the duration of your contract, the full contract amount comes up to $3 million, the public body is not allowed to split the $3 million to bring the procurement contracts below the $1 million threshold in order to enjoy the flexibilities that are permitted for simplified procurements. Similarly, if in estimating the value of the procurement, the value turns out to be, let's say, $500,000, the public body is not allowed to split the procurements to bring them under the threshold for $75,000. The regulations also speak to the reporting requirements of public bodies back to the OPR for both micro and small scale procurements. So we are looking now at simplified procurements within context. Simplified procurements, we need to understand, are simply a subset of the public body's full portfolio of procurement activities for the year. So when you plan your procurement, your annual procurement plan will include all of your procurements. The plan will speak to procurements estimated at over $1 million. And the plan will also include and identify your simplified procurements, both micro and small scale. In general, of course, we know that the procurements are governed by the 10 regulations, and that is the procurements over $1 million, governed by the 10 regulations, as well as the handbooks with general guidelines that you will find on the OPR's website. The simplified procurements, these will be or are guided by or governed by the simplified regulations of 2024, as well as Chairman would have mentioned, the handbook with guidelines for simplified procurements to be issued by the OPR. So that is, that document is well advanced in terms of the development, and we are finalizing for issue. And of course, all public bodies will be advised when that guideline, that handbook with guidelines become available. So under the simplified public procurement regulations, what remains mandatory? Well, the objects of the Act remain as a requirement for simplified procurement. Regulatory oversight by the OPR remains as a requirement. Incorporation of all stages of the public procurement proceedings as far as is practical remains mandatory. And of course, that will include the due diligence that should be exercised by each public body for each procurement proceeding. What remains mandatory, of course, will be reporting to the OPR, and when head ICT comes on, he will address that in greater detail. Also, what remains mandatory will be the maintaining of the records of procurement proceedings by the public body. So under these new regulations, we speak so much about simplified and more flexible. What will no longer be required? So what will no longer be required is that the public bodies will no longer be required to publish in their schedule of planned procurement activities, their micro procurements. So if your stationery, let's say, amounts to 1 ream of paper for the year, then you do not have to publish 1 ream of paper in your schedule on your website or in another electronic format. So small scale procurements over $75,000 up to the 1 million will be required to be published, but not the micro procurements under 75,000. The standstill period will not apply to simplified procurements. Review by the Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee is not required under the Simplified Procurement Regulations. Publication of notice of awards of contracts or purchase orders or framework agreements that you entered into, these are not required under the simplified regulations. So public notices of awards are no longer required. They are not required at all. No notice is required for micro procurement, but as far as small scale procurements go, the public bodies will be required to advise the bidders that participated in the procurement process of the outcome of that particular procurement. Okay, so as we navigate this new public procurement system, we want to be aware of certain things. And one very important point is that under simplified procurement, the procurement must be conducted in accordance with the regulations, because the regulations would advise or would stipulate that if the procurement contract or agreement is entered into in a manner that is not in keeping with the regulations, then that contract or agreement can be deemed void and illegal. It will be rendered void and illegal. Another point that we have to be very careful about is a procuring entity shall not issue a solicitation based on personal preferences. So again, Chairman would have mentioned it specifically. And of course, as you read the regulations for yourselves, you will recognize that there's a lot of flexibility to assist the public body with their procurements. So balancing against that flexibility will be the requirement to be very careful. So a procuring entity shall not issue a solicitation based on personal preferences and shall not restrict a solicitation to well-known suppliers or contractors or widely distributed brands. What is meant to happen is that once a supplier or contractor is able to supply, then they should not be barred from participating in procurement proceedings. So let's look now at procurement methods and procedures for simplified procurement. On the micro procurement, we have the new procurement method called direct contracting. So you can utilize direct contracting on the micro. You can utilize any of the other methods: open, limited, single source. Under small scale procurement, you are not allowed under these regulations to utilize direct contracting. However, you may utilize open, limited, single source. With respect to procedures, under micro procurement only, the public body may, as may be appropriate, utilize verbal quotation. So you can actually call someone on the phone, or you can speak directly to someone face to face if that is what is warranted, and receive quotations. And then the information provided by the suppliers must be captured on the verbal quotation form, which is made available to the public bodies as a schedule to the regulations. So the last page or so of the regulation should be that schedule. So direct contracting is permissible, or verbal quotations is permissible for micro procurements, but not for small scale. And then for both micro and small scale, as the case may be, the public bodies may utilize requests for quotations, requests for proposals, or invitation to bid. Time limits for making submissions. So the first few words you will see under the time limit column are no fewer than. What does that mean? That means that in planning your procurement, the public body will not go beyond these minimum timeframes in providing their suppliers and contractors time to submit quotations, proposals, or bids. Because there are minimum timeframes, while you are not allowed to go under the number of days, you can most certainly, if it is warranted because of the nature of your procurement, or even if it may be requested by your suppliers and contractors, or when you conduct your market research, you realize that based on the nature of the procurement and the complexity, you will need to give more than the minimum time frame the public body is able so to do. Okay, so you are not bound to 10 working days for open bidding if the complexity of the procurement warrants that you give 12 working days or 15 working days. So public bodies need to be very clear on that. So with respect to open bidding, no fewer than 10 working days. With respect to limited bidding, no fewer than 7 working days. With respect to requests for quotations, no fewer than 2 working days. Single and sole source, no fewer than 5 working days for submission of quotations and so forth, either from, with respect to open bidding, the date that you publish the procurement notice, or for the other methods, the date that you issue the document to the suppliers and contractors. So that brings me to the end of my section here. So I will now turn you over to Mr. Aleem Bashk, who is the head of ICT at the OPR, to take you through registration.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. So in terms of registration, so we're looking at micro procurement. For public bodies, there's an introduction of a new registry. And this is a registry that has to be maintained, created and maintained by each public body and for all of the suppliers that they wish to engage with for procurement activities that's less than or equal to $75,000. This public body registry can be either in a manual or electronic format. And the types of information to be collected here are seen here on the screen, and this is listed in the regulation. In terms of the small scale procurement, the requirement for registration for suppliers is still on the procurement depository, but suppliers are not required to become pre-qualified to engage in activities for under $1 million. All right, the status is that they just need to be on a registration status. With this as well, the types of information that are required for each supplier is captured here. And again, the depository has these fields for you to be able to review that information. For the greater than $1 million, right now there are no changes to the requirement in terms of suppliers still need to be pre-qualified for each line of business that they wish to be engaged in before engaging any activity with public bodies. In terms of supplier participation, so in terms of micro procurement, public bodies can solicit suppliers and contractors who belong to their registry for the micro procurement. A public body can also engage a supplier contractor who is not in their registry, but it must be ensured that they enter the information relating to the supplier contractor on their registry no later than 21 days after the award of the contract. So that's very important to note. Now, also important to note is that the maintenance of this public body registry is being maintained by the supplier. So some persons may interpret this that, for instance, it shall ensure that the supplier contractor is registered no later than 21 days after the award of the contract. So to do that, it's just a matter of the public body entering and maintaining the information within that 21-day time period. As it pertains now to the small scale procurement, again, public bodies can engage suppliers and contractors who are registered on the procurement depository. If, however, they want to engage a supplier who is not on the depository as yet, they can do this. But there is one thing that must be taken care of is that the public body must ensure that the supplier contractor who is selected is registered in procurement depository prior to the award of the contract. All right, so you must ensure that the supplier has gone into the depository, has all of the information submitted before awarding the contract. Point to note as well, in terms of foreign suppliers here. So in the past, we have had complaints or issues relating to foreign suppliers who have been reluctant to come onto the depository. They thought either the depository was not worth their time or the size of business in Trinidad was too small. So as it stands right now, a public body can engage with a foreign supplier. However, before awarding the contract to the supplier, the foreign supplier must be registered on the depository as well. So looking at consultants. So consultants' requirements are very similar, if not the same, as suppliers and contractors. A public body can engage suppliers and can engage consultants who are on their registry. If they are not on the registry, they can still continue to engage with those consultants. However, they must ensure that those consultants' information are entered on their depository within 21 days, no later than 21 days after the award of the contract. In terms of the small scale procurement with consultants, likewise, public body can engage with these consultants, whether or not they're on the depository. If they are not on the depository, the consultant who is selected must be registered on the depository prior to the award of the contract. So there have been some exemptions which I've identified as it relates to registration. And these registry exemptions apply to both micro procurement and small scale procurement. So basically it applies for suppliers and contractors under $1 million. So these exemptions include payments to a public utility, right? So TNTech doesn't need to be registered in here. The acquisition of goods or services, which is only available via online platform. So for example, if you need to purchase services, let's say from Facebook, there's Facebook marketing and there's a boost that needs to be done, which many people utilize, then these Facebook will be exempted from either registry. If there's any acquisition of goods, works, or services that are required for the conduct of business of the state outside of Trinidad and Tobago, well then these suppliers and contractors are exempted from these registries. And so, for example, for instance, a public body may be having a trade show overseas, and they may be engaging with some foreign suppliers. Those suppliers would not be needed to enter on the registry. Right. In terms of acquisition of air travel and hotel services and other expenses related to conferences, foreign trade fairs, and training seminars, these are also exempted. And lastly, the acquisition of goods, services, or works during an emergency. Now let's focus on reporting requirements of public bodies for these levels of procurement. So for the micro procurement, there is a new reporting requirement here. So it's more of an aggregate, summarized reporting. So again, your regulations would have stipulated very detailed here, these 5 items which needs to be reported on. The office is currently developing the template, which is to be shared with all public bodies, which will be utilized for the reporting of Q3. The small scale reporting for small scale procurement and greater than 1 million, there are no changes to the reporting template. So the same template will be used in terms of the number of fields. And in terms of the report submission timeline, all of the levels of procurement, the reporting timeline is no later than 3 weeks after the end of each quarter. All right, so let's be mindful of that. Do note any submission made to the office after the timeline here, those public bodies will be identified as being non-compliant. Okay? So just to reiterate again, the template for the micro procurement will be shared with public bodies in early June, and the regular template will be used for the greater than $75,000. Right, so at this point in time, I would like to hand over back to Ms. Brown, who will summarize today.
Thank you. Yes, so much. Okay, so just very quickly by way of summary, let me just say that, of course, the slides will be provided subsequent to the session, as well as a user guide to the simplified regs, already referenced, really, not just the user guide, but also already referenced to assist public bodies in navigating the regulations. But by way of summary of what is contained in the regulations and the applications, we can look at the fact that the annual procurement plan, both micro procurements and small scale procurements are to be included in the plan, as well as, of course, the other procurements, which will be those over $1 million. So it's one plan that speaks to all of the procurements. The annual schedule of planned procurement activities, no need to include your micro procurements, but certainly your small scale procurements, those over the 75,000 up to $1 million must be included. Review by the Procurement and Disposal Advisory Committee. These regulations do not require that public bodies have the review by PDAC for these levels of procurements. These regulations do not require the implementation of the standstill period for the simplified procurements. These regulations do not require the public body to publish their notices on their website of their awards of contract or the framework agreements. However, with respect to the informing of participating suppliers and contractors, those who participate in a particular bidding process, for small scale procurement, the regulations require that the public bodies advise those suppliers and contractors of the outcome of the proceedings. Verbal quotations may be utilized for micro procurements, but not for small scale procurements. Direct contracting may be used for micro, but not for small scale. Suppliers or contractors for micro procurement can be sourced from the public bodies registry. Suppliers and contractors for small scale procurement must be sourced from the procurement depository hosted by the OPR. With respect to quarterly reporting, as Mr. Bash would have gone through, that is required for both micro and small scale. Under micro, the requirement is to report in aggregate, and of course, we will give additional guidance in this regard. But under small scale, the requirement is for reporting on every single contract and every single framework agreement. So that's it from us. And I will hand you over to Head of Communications at the OPR, Mr. Mararoy.
Thanks so much, Pastora and Aline. We will now go into our Q&A segment, and I will ask Communications Officer Rhonda Joy Lewis to take us through. So what we will do is that we will retrieve the questions from the chat, we will read them out, and then members of the team will respond to those questions. Rhonda?
Thank you very much, Ms. Roy. We actually received some questions by email from some public bodies, so we'd like to address those questions first. Our first question is, will the procuring entity be charged?
Good afternoon, everyone. So with respect to this question relates specifically to Regulation 12 and Regulation 17 of the regulations. Regulation 12 explores the offense of victimization, and Regulation 17 explores the offense of breach of confidentiality. And it begins by stating a person who contravenes this regulation is liable. Now, it's important to take note of Section 16 of the Interpretation Act, which states that reference to a person is to be construed as reference to a corporation or unincorporated body. So while these provisions make reference to a person, it is not limited to an individual and will extend to the procuring entity.
Thank you for your response. We received another question. Can the single or sole source justification for selection of one tender be approved by the delegated authority if the tender is within that delegated authority's limit?
With respect to this question, it is important to take note of Regulation 9, which permits delegation of authority by the accounting officer with respect to financial limits and does not limit such authority to the use of any particular method. As such, once the procurement undertaken utilizing the sole or single source method of selection is within the financial limits of the delegation to qualify as a simplified procurement, the person delegated can approve that procurement. Note, however, that nothing prohibits a procuring entity from limiting the accounting officer's delegation of authority to the use of certain methods.
Thank you for your response. Will the OPR provide a standardized format to report a contract awarded?
So the OPR is currently formulating the templates to capture the information required in Regulation 10.5, and this template will be available on the OPR's website for use by public bodies.
With regard to Regulation 11, Part 2, the time for suppliers to make submissions was addressed. Is 2 days stated in C realistic? Tenderers are not submitting a bid as they may not see the email in time to get a price from their suppliers.
The Regulation 11 addresses the time frame for making submissions. And you would know that in Regulation 11C, it states no fewer than 2 working days, which means that a procuring entity can stipulate more than 2 working days when necessary. The intention here is to simplify the process and to avoid unnecessary delays. Reducing the minimum time frame to be applied to 2 days as opposed to stipulating a greater time frame or longer time frame to 4 days.
Thank you for your response. Regulation 16.3 should have specifically indicated that the verbal request for a quote should be from a procurement officer. This can lead to confusion as quotations from verbal requests may have ethical issues.
So Regulation 16.3 states that where a procuring entity is engaged in a micro procurement, a verbal quotation may be submitted. So where the procuring entity is to utilize the verbal quotation, given that this forms part of the procurement process and the NPO is ultimately responsible for all simplified procurements, and I would refer you to Regulation 8, which captures the responsibility of the NPO. It is understood here that any request for verbal quotations will be made by the NPO or other person authorized to do so within the procuring entity. The intention here is not to limit the ability of making requests to only the NPO, as it may not be practical and it doesn't offer the procuring entities the flexibility that the simplified procurement regulations wanted to achieve. So having regard to the nature, value, and risk of a procurement, as well as the internal control framework within a particular body, other persons may also be authorized to request or receive such quotes. However, I will also direct you to sub-regulation 4. That's Regulation 16, sub-regulation 4, which requires the NPO to keep a written record of the verbal quotation by utilizing a prescribed verbal quotation form. If you look at that form, you will see that the NPO is required to sign off on all procurements, and there's a section there that requires the NPO to also give his comments. And in this way, this ensures that the NPO's overarching responsibility for all procurement is maintained.
Thank you for your response. Reference is made to Part 2 of the Regulation 19.1. As far as practicable, suggests that requirements are relaxed in the core activities of the procurement proceedings and therefore not undertaking, not undertaking any of the steps in Regulation 19.2 to 5 shall not be mandatory. Is this correct?
So the phrase "as far as practicable" in Regulation 19.1 should not be construed as stating, or should not be interpreted to mean that the stages identified therein are not mandatory. Note that "as far as practicable" means to be done to the highest, or to be done or achieved to the greatest degree possible within the current circumstances. So the use of the word "shall" here in subregulation 1 makes it mandatory for a procuring entity to incorporate all stages identified as far as practicable. However, notwithstanding that, it should be noted that the inclusion of the words "as far as practicable" also affords the procuring entity a level of flexibility when satisfying the requirements to Regulation 19, and takes into consideration that in some instances, one or more of the requirements outlined in paragraphs A to D may not apply. I will invite our technical head, Ms. Pastora Brown, to give some examples of where the procurement stages, all aspects of the procurement stages might not be applicable.
Okay, thanks, Anupa. Okay, so as far as practicable simply means in planning the procurement, the procuring entity must consider the 4 stages of public procurement. And what you do is based on the procurement. So if you are buying 1 ream of paper versus if you are buying boxes of paper, or if you are buying any smaller quantity of items versus if you are buying a larger quantity of items, if you are engaging in a very simple and straightforward procurement versus if you are engaging in a more complex type procurement activity, that is where the term used in the regulations as far as practicable gives the procuring entity the flexibility to examine the good work or service it wishes to procure, the characteristics and nature of the good work or service, the way the supply market operates, and then determine exactly how far do I have to go in trying to develop specifications. So if I have to develop, do I, as a matter of fact, develop specifications for one ream of paper? I might simply have a line description that says one ream of letter size paper, and that's the specification. However, if I wanted to procure a more complex item, of course, the degree to which I will develop the specifications will be something totally different. So I hope that that is a helpful explanation for the term as far as practicable.
Thank you for your response, Ms. Brown. Is approval from relevant delegated authority applicable?
Again, regulation 9 here is important. And the short answer is yes, where approval of the accounting officer has been delegated as permitted under regulation 9, approval from the accounting officer with respect to regulation 19.4E will capture any such delegation.
Thank you. Reference is made to Part 3, Regulation 24.4E. Too many pre-qualified suppliers can be a reason to limit participation. Is this true?
So again, the short answer to that is no. Having too many pre-qualified suppliers or contractors does not justify limiting participation. In such cases, and in accordance with Regulation 9, Sub-Regulation 2 of the Pre-Qualification and Pre-Selection Regulations, a procuring entity may conduct pre-selection proceedings to limit the number of supplier contractors who will be invited to make submissions. However, I also want to draw your attention to Section 18 of the Act, which allows the procuring entity to limit participation in procurement proceedings to promote local industry development and local content. Any limitation, however, must be declared by the procuring entity, as well as the nature of the limitation and the reason for that limitation, and must also be included in the record of procurement proceedings.
Thank you. We now have a question on the OPR registry. Will the OPR provide a standardized format for the registry?
Regulation 26.1 requires a procuring entity to establish and maintain a registry in accordance with the OPR's guidelines. So the OPR will be issuing guidelines to address that and will consider providing a template or standardized format to be utilized by public bodies.
Thank you. Any statutory documents will be necessary or due diligence?
The information to be submitted for the purposes of registration on a public bodies registry is outlined in 26.3 of the regulations, and 26.3 states that a registry shall contain the following information in respect of each supplier contractor: name, national identification number, where the supplier contractor is an individual, address, contact number, type of business, and description of goods, works, or services.
Thank you for your response. What happens after 21 days if the supplier does not comply to be registered? The clause is silent.
So after the 21-day period, if the supplier contractor does not comply, well, first I want to point out that
Okay, I'll just want to answer them. So in that case, the requirement is from the public body. So the public body is responsible for maintaining the registry. So it's not that the supplier is going to come onto the system to complete the registration. The onus is on the public body to complete and maintain the record within that 21-day period.
right. Just to add to Mr. Bash's statement, So while the onus is on the procuring entity to ensure that the supplier contractor is registered in the registry, if after the 21-day period, the procuring entity was unable to get that supplier contractor to be registered, that procuring entity can then move on to the second rank supplier contractor.
Okay, so just to elaborate a little bit, how we actually see it working. The information required for the registry, and if I went through, I could just go through again the name of the contractor, the national identification if the contractor is an individual, the address, the contact information, type of business, and the description of goods, works, or services that the supplier would offer. So just in practical terms, an easy way to get this information would be so let's say we are starting off blank. This is a new system. We do not have a supplier registry in the procuring entity. So you source your suppliers maybe from the depository as it exists right now. You do online searches, you network with other public bodies depending on the procurement activity, and you get contact information, sufficient contact information that you are able to invite a supplier or contractor to participate in your procurement. So you begin your registry in a very organic manner. You put in the information that you have, and how do you complete that information? You complete it very simply by requesting it when you approach the contractors to submit a quotation or a bid. So it's very easy. So this 21 days is really just to provide some guidance to the public body. You are very busy, and you may very well, you are given additional time to register the supplier or contractor so that next time you go out, because remember, we are building the system from the ground up. Next time you go out, you will have more and more registered suppliers and contractors who you can approach for your procurement needs. So hopefully that brought a little clarity there.
Yes, indeed. All right, so we're just wrapping up the pre-submitted questions, and the supplier is asking, the public body, is asking, will the OPR provide a standardized format to report the awards for micro procurement?
Yes, we will be providing that in early June.
Thank you for your response. What about a standardized format to register all complaints?
Yes, that will be provided by the OPR as well.
All right. And reference is made to Regulation 36.2. The procuring entity shall utilize the standard bidding documents issued by the office. Standard documents, for example, the requisition and solicitation documents, optional for procurements under 75,000.
The OPR, with respect to this, the OPR wants to maintain standard documents to ensure transparency, accountability, proper record keeping purposes. But the details may vary based on the nature, risk, value, and method being utilized for the particular procurement activity.
Thank you. And the part two to that question is, will the OPR issue simplified solicitation document templates for procurements under $75,000 and single or sole source procurement?
So there is a template that is already available for low risk, low value procurement that the procuring entity can continue to use for simplified procurements, notwithstanding that as we continue to develop this system, within a short space of time, the OPR does intend to provide additional solicitation documents to support public bodies in their simplified procurements.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. So now we're going to take some of the questions posed by you in our Q&A portal as well as in the chat. And we'll start with this question. Has the OPR considered the creation of a due diligence tool or template to assist public bodies to become compliant with Part 3, Section 15?
So if I could take a shot at that one. So Regulation 15 speaks to where a procuring entity is engaged in a simplified procurement, it shall comply with the due diligence requirement set out in the guidelines. Such guidelines to be prepared by the OPR, and we are in the process of preparing a handbook with guidelines on all the matters that require guidelines to be produced as indicated in the regulations, as well as general guidelines on all of the on the entire regulation.
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Khan. All right, we have another question. Exemption from regulations, simplified procurement. Is the acquisition of air travel related to local travel or regional and international travel?
All travel.
Right? And reference is made to page 186. Does this refer to public notice on the website or actual written correspondence to be prepared and issued to all contractors?
86.
186.
Of the ranks.
It says written. That is 37.1.
37.1. Yeah.
Right. It says that a procuring entity shall, within 7 days of the award of a contract or entering into a framework agreement, inform each supplier or contractor who participated in the procurement in writing. So yes, it's not a website. You have to inform each in writing.
So our next question that we'd like to address this afternoon. What is the expected role of the evaluation committee at each level?
What at each level of the procurements? Right. So the regulations would have spoken to the evaluation committee as again with again some degree of flexibility. The evaluation committee will be required to review the submissions that are received and to prepare an evaluation report, which would be submitted for approval by the officer with the appropriate level of delegated responsibility. So according to the public body, that might be the named procurement officer, it might be a senior manager, or it might be the accounting officer.
Thank you for your response. In cases of emergencies, critical need, business continuity, can the public body engage a foreign vendor who is not registered but ensures that the registration process is completed in a timely manner?
Yes, absolutely. Once you are within the meaning of what is an emergency as defined in the Act. So you should look carefully at it to ensure that you are in keeping with that definition, because very importantly, it speaks to life, property, it speaks to equipment, business continuity is immediately at risk. And it also speaks very importantly where standards of public health, welfare, or safety need to be reestablished without delay. So if indeed what you're experiencing is within the meaning of emergency, you can indeed do so. But you have to ensure that your procurement proceedings indicate exactly what is the emergency. I passed already that.
All right, we've seen a question that just came in. Are petty cash purchases considered micro purchases? For example, the purchase of one ream of paper via petty cash. would that be considered a micro purchase with all regulations and reporting requirements for micro purchases?
Excellent question. And again, there is so much flexibility that is awarded to public bodies under this new simplified public procurement regulations. So the issue of petty cash will certainly be addressed in the guidelines that are being provided. And essentially, there are rules of engagement for the utilization of your petty cash. Basically, what the guidelines will say is that some public bodies may maintain or manage a petty cash system or reimbursement system. And that system will be based on the policy. So it will be part of the financial regulations of the particular public body. So you will have approved policy to treat with how you treat with your finances. And out of that, you will have a policy to treat with your petty cash and your reimbursables. Most likely your policy will speak to the fact that that float will be maintained for incidentals, the one-off, very low value, like a one ream of paper. So there is a distinction between what is managed by your petty cash, and your policy will also have a statement to the effect that the petty cash, the management of the petty cash or the petty cash system will not be used to abuse the public procurement regulations. So again, if something fits within your petty cash, all well and good, but you do not try to break up the procurements to circumvent the regulations that exist for micro. So in a word, there is an invisible line between your petty cash and micro procurements. However, your policy document approved at the highest levels of the organization will make that distinction. And of course, when you submit your handbook of special guidelines to the OPR, you will be very clear in terms of your petty cash limit and where your micro procurement will take off from there.
So stakeholders, this is just a plug to be sure to be familiar with the contents of the regulation. So someone is just asking about the definition of emergency, and that is in the regulation. So you can make reference to that. What is the OPR's position? What is the OPR's position on the use of petty cash for micro procurement or emergencies? Just making sure, right? Thanks, sorry. Yes, okay. So I'll go on to another question. Exemption from this act, section 58A. Subject to the regulations made under section 63, the procurement of goods and services up to $1 million are exempt from the procurement requirements under this act. Given that the act did not mention works as defined in the act, please advise if works are subject to the provisions of the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Regulations 2024.
So with respect to this question, it should be noted that the act, this provision was further amended by Section 7 of the Finance Act of 2023 to include works within Section 58A of the Act.
A number of suppliers have been complaining that their registration to the OPR depository takes long, or they have not received approval for all their selected categories. Can the procuring entity still conduct business with them?
Okay, so we have to look back in terms of the different categories. So in terms of the procurement, it's greater than $1 million. That is the regular procurement, I would term it as. And suppliers will need to become pre-qualified to be able to provide the goods, works, or service so that it can be in compliance with the existing regulation as it stands right now. For values which are under $1 million, and that will be the small scale procurement, which is the 75 to 1 million, there is no requirement to be pre-qualified. So it means, as it is, a public body does not need to go in or to actually pre-qualify the submission. The requirement would be for the supplier to at least at minimum have the information that is stipulated there that meets the registration requirements. It is to note, though, that the system that we currently have right now doesn't allow a button to state that you are registered, but that will be coming on stream in the near future, whereby the depository will be changed from a database of pre-qualified suppliers to a database of registered suppliers. But before that change can be made, there's another change in the regulation which will be coming and which will impact suppliers and contractors and public bodies as well. And in the case of under 75,000, there is no need for any type of registration on the depository. You can just utilize the public bodies registry.
Okay, I just wanted to add too, based on the framing of the question. It seemingly is suggesting that the approval is coming from maybe the OPR. The approval is really coming, well, it's approval in terms of the pre-qualified, being pre-qualified. And that is the responsibility of the public bodies. So clearly, if the procuring entity wants to conduct business with this particular supplier or contractor, they should really go in and pre-qualify them as a first step and then use them, right? Okay.
Okay, so we have another question. Can you please explain further Regulation 6B? What are examples of framework agreements?
Okay, so there's a definition in the Parent Act for framework agreements. I will try to put it the way I think about it. So a framework agreement is an agreement. It can be a one-to-one agreement. So there can be one public body and one supplier or contractor involved in a framework agreement. A framework agreement can also be a one-to-many relationship agreement, one public body, many suppliers and contractors. It can also be many-to-many relationship. Many public bodies could collaborate and implement a framework agreement involving one or more supplier or contractor. But there is a definition in the Act, so you can check it there. In addition to that, on the OPR's website, you will find a handbook with general guidelines describing framework agreements and how you can put a framework agreement into place in your procurements. In addition to the general guidelines, you will also find a standard bidding document there for framework agreements. So there's a lot of information already placed on the website that can help the public bodies that wish to participate in a framework agreement. However, very simply, trying to answer the question, a framework agreement is an agreement made between a public body and one or more suppliers and contractors based on an invitation from the public body to suppliers and contractors to enter into a framework agreement. So you firstly have your solicitation document that says, I want to buy stationery items. Here's my long list of stationery items, or my long list of PPEs, or whatever sort of repetitive procurement items that you may have, or even if you know you need to prepare for emergency situations and you want to have an agreement in place with one or more suppliers so that when you need the particular item, it's very easy for you to just call upon these suppliers who are already qualified, pre-qualified, and who you have already deemed competent to be able to provide you with the goods, works, and services that you need. Entering into a framework agreement, it reduces some of the burden associated with your procurement, because again, it's just very, very easy to go to suppliers and contractors within your listing or within your agreement, and ask them, in some cases, I need 5 of this, please give me a quote, if that is the way you framed your contract. Or you may say, we agreed on the price for the unit, so just give me 5 now. So basically, in layman's terms, that is how it is meant to work. A framework agreement can be established depending on what it is, on what you require for maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years. Again, how you come to determine how you are going to implement your framework agreement really begins when you examine your procurement need and you plan how you are going to engage the supply market so that you will have continuity of supply of whatever that good, work, or service is as you require it. So I hope all of that helped, but I do encourage you to take a look at the Handbook with General Guidelines for additional information.
Thank you very much, Ms. Brown. Given the title of the presentation, which includes disposal, could you kindly clarify if there's an intention to address the disposal aspect, considering the threshold values of the simplified procurement procedures?
Not at this time, no. The fact is, in terms of disposal activities, what has been reported to the OPR is not very significant. So that in terms of bringing flexibility and creating greater efficiency, including disposal activities within this threshold is not a consideration at this time.
Just to add what the chairman would have stated as well, section 58A of the Act would have provided an exemption from the Parent Act with respect to procurement of goods, works, and services up to $1 million. So given that it only applies to procurement requirements under the Act still applies to the disposal aspect for all values of procurement. The Act, that would be the Act and the 10 regulations made thereunder.
Thank you, Anupa. Please confirm whether section 18(1)(c) can be applied to the procurement of goods and services at the Trinidad and Tobago's overseas mission.
Yes, indeed. That particular regulation was drafted with our foreign missions in mind, so that you don't have to engage, well, the supplier contractor that you engage with doesn't have to be registered in the registry or in the procurement depository. I would hasten to add, though, that you are still required to ensure that your procurement files are maintained, right? The exemption is simply related to not having to use someone who is registered in your depository or in the procurement, in your registry or in the procurement depository, because of course it would be unrealistic to expect that you are conducting the business of the state in a foreign land, and you are required to procure goods, works, and services. And once it's not over $1 million, that no one would really, and it's $1 million TT dollars, then no one we expect will be eager to have to come on to the procurement depository to engage in that activity with you, right?
Under registry exemptions, are Caribbean Airlines or PTSC considered public entities?
Under registry exemptions.
Yeah, utilities.
They are utilities.
Or
Utilities, my
Property.
apologies.
under the meaning of utilities?
Yeah.
And there's
No, absolutely not.
That's-
Caribbean Airlines and PTSC, no.
Concerning the verbal quotation, what happens if after the verbal quote is done, the supplier or suppliers change their quotation? What measures are there to keep the verbal quote valid?
That is a very excellent question. And I think it will be one that it will be one that is related to your procurement risk. If the public body were to request a verbal quotation, you would have to have like a preliminary discussion with your supplier or contractor, letting them know you are taking a formal quotation, etc., etc. So while there isn't a space here for them to actually sign, when I speak of risk, I'm speaking about your decision as a public body to utilize a verbal quotation. So, for example, one would imagine that you would decide to use a verbal quotation where you have an immediate need. So, if you get a verbal quotation, just say, yes, you get a verbal quotation from a supplier and they said, well, okay, the item is $10. And by the time you reach the supplier, he decides it's $15. Well, then you have a decision to make. How do you manage your risk? Well, that will be up to you. There, in that regard, then, would utilizing a verbal quotation be the best option to mitigate your risk of the supplier holding its price? So these are decisions to be taken in planning and rolling out how you do your procurement.
Thank you, Ms. Brown.
Okay, so we have a question, another very good question that a lot of public bodies have been asking. It says that the budget division requires submission of invoices in order to release funds. And according to the OPR, you have to have releases in order to purchase, well, to procure, really. Therefore, how can we procure if we don't have a release? And advise what we should do. Okay, so yes, we understand the difficulty in grappling with that. The OPR has advocated to the Ministry of Finance that we need to find a workaround this particular matter that is facing public bodies and that in fact is constraining their procurement activities. Because of course the requirements of the budget division in terms of seeing their invoices before they release is part of their own management, cash management of budget, of the budget, and when their inflows come in relative to projected spend. So we have raised the matter with the Ministry of Finance, indicating to them the challenge that public bodies have been expressing to us. And there is a commitment to find a way so that maybe we could consider an alternative that will then allow for you to undertake your procurement. It's very important though that you have some assurance of the funding before you engage with the procurement, because anything could happen along the way that could cause your procurement to be a misprocurement by the fact of even how you in your solicitation documents, how do you position when a project has maybe different phases or stages. And that you have to pay particular attention to your strategy of how you can do it. And if there are instances in which you can, in distinct groupings, progress on your project, based on your availability of funds, then your solicitation documents must so indicate, which will then allow you to perhaps proceed on a phase basis, right? So this one, I cannot give you a definitive solution to this. It's not within, my authority, the OPR's authority to do it, but we have made a case to the Ministry of Finance, and we will continue to do so, and until we get something that is workable for public bodies.
Can a procuring entity issue a public notice to invite interested suppliers and contractors to indicate their interest in doing business with the entity and require that they submit all necessary information?
Brilliant idea. Definitely, that will be very, very helpful. It will help the public body to be able to build this registry very quickly.
Okay, so there's another question here. Any way in the regulation, I guess they were trying to say, does the regulations speak to or allow for works being done without a PU? If the quote is not obtained on time? Well, that would have to be only in instances of emergency, where it requires you to respond, and you are unable to. It's not good practice, I must say. Before you going into any arrangement, you should have an estimate. But if by chance you're in an emergency situation and you don't have a quote, then well, if it is below $75,000, you could take something verbally, as we have said, but you will have to really document and provide your justification in terms of moving ahead without a PU. But I could foresee that there are instances in which that could happen. But your procurement departments would need to, in terms of your own internal systems, how do you deal with instances like that, right? Is it that you call and you get the approval based on maybe some estimate from your accounting officer? But this is not certainly not best practice, and you should refrain from doing that, except if it's a case of life or limb or some urgent situation. And then your accounting officer should certainly know what is the situation, right? Did we address that already?
Can you please give us an example of direct contracting?
Okay, all right. So direct contracting, and again, we caution that we want to take all of these flexibilities into context. So in engaging with direct contracting, I will just try to go straight to the example. So we do have some examples that we would have considered at the OPR that the public bodies may find helpful in when they determine, or when they try to determine whether or not direct contracting is the way to go. So this is just to stimulate your thinking process, and it is by no means cast in stone. But let us take, for example, the public body suddenly calls a meeting. So it's not a planned meeting where you can go to your caterers the day before or or a week before and ask them to quote and to provide the catering for a particular day in the future. You are in the midst of a meeting, unexpectedly the meeting goes on and on and on and on, and the organization decides because the meeting has gone on, persons should be given a meal. So direct contracting will now require that you probably send someone down the road to procure meals, or you call and order meals and pick up meals. So that is an example of direct contracting. So it's not to be taken out of context. Because where you know on a regular basis, you have your meetings and you need to do your catering, you may wish to consider, for example, having your framework agreement in place, or having at least your pre-qualified listing of persons who you would run to in order to get your catering. So again, we are taking it in balance. Because do remember that you will have to provide justification for your procurement decisions. Suppose an officer is out of office doing business and a situation arises. As we say, it might not necessarily be an emergency. So which is why we say direct contracting, you may consider it to be a procurement where you have identified a need that you need to fill immediately, but you cannot categorize that need as an emergency, given the definition of an emergency. So that is when you would engage in direct contracting. So the officer is out there and for some reason needs something. The battery dies and okay, I need to run to the nearest gas station to buy a battery. Well, okay, right? Tire blown. And I need to, well, whether it's a patch or whether it's replaced the tire, or, I mean, we may be ridiculous with the examples, but it's just to give you an example of when you would use direct contracting. You have an immediate need, and so you need to procure anything so that you can continue to do your business. Yeah, so those are two, and I'm sure you can come up with many, many more as you actually engage in your procurement activities or engage in the operations of your business.
Thank you for your response, Ms. Brown. So we're seeing a question here. Can the same vendor receive orders for different categories for the limits of micro or small scale? Or is it only one vendor limit is $75,000, regardless of the number of categories ordered?
Right. So the micro threshold and the small scale threshold has nothing to do or does not have everything to do with the value of the contract awarded. It does in a way, but not directly. The threshold speaks to when I estimate the value of the procurement of my stationery for the year. It is either under 75,000 or over 75,000. It has nothing to do with a supplier or contract, with how many contracts and the value of the contracts awarded to a supplier or contractor. It all has to do with, I estimate this is the value of my procurement, and based on my estimate of the value of my procurement, I will use the appropriate legislation, regulations, procurement strategy for my procurement.
I would just want to add to that you need to be careful that you don't engage in splitting of the contracts in order to stay under the threshold of, whether it is micro or small scale. So you need to be very careful in that respect. It might be complementary goods or services, and then you split it in order to get it within there. So just be careful with that, just to add what Pastora said.
Yes. Okay, we're seeing a question coming in here. Can you outline what will be considered as victimization and confidentiality breaches under Regulations 12 and 17.
So, with respect to Regulation 12, in prohibition of victimization, it speaks to the what the victimization pertains to. So, if a person shall not be, and we should look at these words carefully, dismissed, suspended, demoted, disciplined, harassed, denied a benefit, or otherwise negatively affected. So look at these keywords, and this will kind of give you an idea of the different forms of victimization. With respect to confidentiality, Regulation 17 will obtain, and confidentiality will touch on concern the use of sensitive information, right? Disclosure of the information, which would be contrary to law, impede law enforcement, prejudice the legitimate commercial interests of a supplier or contractor, or impede competition. The provision also goes further on to discuss in publishing information, what it is a procuring entity, how the procuring entity shall treat with such submissions. So they will want to avoid disclosure if the contents to competing suppliers or contractors or to any other person not authorized to have access to this type of information. And it could include any discussions, communications, negotiations, or this dialogue between a procuring entity and a supplier or contractor. So that will just provide you some context in terms of how confidentiality is treated with under Regulation 17.
Thank you very much for your response, Ms. Mitchell. We have another question. In terms of the processes of a marketing and branding department, how does the simplified procedures impact on the state enterprise providing sponsorships or donations, whether in cash format or a procured good or service?
So touching on the issue of sponsorship, grants, or donations. So you would appreciate that this is a particular area that, based on some of the practical reasons, you might not necessarily be able to follow procurement practices, processes, or some of the conditions or requirements as set out, right? As such, we have a very broad definition of public money under the Act, and questions, we would have gotten some questions before from some public bodies regarding this issue. It is an issue that we are treating with and engaging external counsel on, but it is something that when it is you look at what obtains with respect to sponsorship, grants, or donations, it's very, very hard to see how procurement rules and requirements could now be imposed on this type of arrangement. But that is the most I would want to see on the issue of sponsorship, grants, or donations.
Thank you for your response. Ms. Brown?
So I noted the question spoke about, the writer was very careful to say sponsorship, donations, and procured works and services, making the clear distinction between disposal, which is sponsorship and donations, and procurement, which is works or services. Yeah, so you still want to be careful of your procurements at the end. They comply with the legislation. And I will not repeat what head legal already said about disposal via sponsorship and donations.
Regulation 2 makes reference to emergency. With reference to business continuity, does this apply to the public body only? Or can we treat matters that affect our clients' business continuity as emergency also?
So, okay, ahead, Liddy.
Yeah, sorry, Ms. Hart.
Go ahead.
So if it is, you look at the definition of emergency under Regulation 2, yes, there are certain conditions, certain examples laid out. Means an exceptional or unforeseeable situation, life, property, equipment, or business continuity. So we're asking if it is the public body, does the public body only, or can we treat the matters that affect business clients, business continuity as an emergency? Business continuity in this context just treats with the public body only and does not obtain or applies to the client's business continuity as an emergency. So that would be the response relative to that area of emergency and business continuity.
So we have a question. How many emergencies are allowed? To give context, emergency response vehicles come in for an emergency service. If there are more than 5 vehicles that come in one day for different faulty parts to be changed, would this still be considered as emergency?
Okay, well, I'm a little bit stymied because I do not have full information. But if it is that your business is providing emergency services, and well, by now, having been in business for a while, you should understand what your requirements are. And in so doing, you would understand what framework agreement or other type of arrangement you will need to put in place to treat with the repairs of your vehicles as they come in. Because remember, framework agreements can also be used not just for the regular recurring type procurements like your stationery or your water, but definitely also for when you have other types of emergencies that you are able to foresee. The definition of emergency speaks to, let me go, exceptional, so not on a regular, and unforeseeable. So it's something that hits you out of the blue. Not your regular maintenance of your emergency vehicles. For that, you have sufficient time to put arrangements in place.
Thank you for your response, Ms. Brown. With respect to section 35B, does the OPR have a specific metric or standard for a time and cost that qualifies as disproportionate as to a specific value of the subject of the procurement, or is this determination or decision reside within the public body?
This is 35.
35B.
B. Sorry, so it says, it speaks here, let me just get the context. Use of limited bidding for small scale procurement. A procuring entity may utilize limited bidding for a small scale procurement where the subject of the procurement is specialized or the time and cost required to evaluate a large number of submissions would be disproportionate to the value of the subject of the procurement. And that is an excellent question. And it takes us right back to what we say to public bodies on a daily basis. You are responsible for planning your procurement. How do you plan? You plan based on the information that you have before you. So the regulations give you the guidance in terms of you can utilize this flexibility if you determine these conditions exist. So it's all up to you to examine the information that you have before you in terms of what are your procurement needs, and what is the best way to go about doing the procurement to ensure that you meet your needs. Disproportionate, I can just try to give you an example, and I've been using that example throughout. If I need to procure stationery, but I need to procure of a small quantity, do I invest an inordinate amount of time in the planning and the execution of the procurement in order to procure a relatively small value good, work, or service? So as Trinidadians, some of us may be familiar with the term, the candle costing more than the funeral. So maybe if you keep that in mind, it will help you as you plan your procurement, because you want to ensure that in planning and executing your procurement, you promote the object of efficiency. So you will want to do you will want to ensure that you complete your procurement in within the most reasonable time frame and at minimal cost. And that cost might even include the level of effort required by the human resource of the procuring entity to plan and execute the procurement. So these are the things that we take into consideration and you document in your market research report and in your procurement strategy development form, as well as in your evaluation report, the reasons behind your decision. And of course, where appropriate, you can cite the legislation and explain your interpretation of it.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Does the OPR endorse the creation of a complaints office within the public body to comply with Part 8, Section 47, 1 to 2?
Well, I would say I would be careful about endorsements. I think that is a decision for the accounting officer, the CEO, permanent secretary. If in your estimation, your determination, you deem it necessary to, have that a separate office, well, by all means, but it's not a requirement. It is how the accounting officer would want to organize the public body such that it is able to efficiently review the complaints and process it in accordance with Part 8 of the regulations. So it really is up to the accounting officer.
Thank you, Ms. Khan. And what I believe may be our final question, with regard to Regulation 10.2, how can a public body confirm if a supplier or contractor is engaging as per the regulations for the first time? What is in place in the instance the person is engaged and then it is identified it is not their first time?
Excellent question. So we have some steps that we will share with you. So in fairness to us all, public body as well as regulator, remember these provisions are new and we are working and we will continue to work together to ensure that we roll them out appropriately and improve on them as time goes by. But just as a suggestion, and we do have this captured in the draft of the regulation of the general guidelines that the OPR will soon be issuing. This has to, we have to actually, as you are rightly pointing out, create some steps in terms of how we will manage together this one-time waiver that is allowed to the supplier or contractor. So allow me please to go through what we think the steps are. And of course, we would always be very glad to hear back from you if you have additional suggestions that can help this particular aspect of the system. So step one, and we are starting from ground zero. Yes, we have no such listing at this point in time in terms of who may or may not have been granted a one-time waiver. So step one, going forward, now that we have the regs in place and we are rolling them out like this, the public body goes ahead and invites bids or quotes from suppliers or contractors. Step two, the supplier or contractor, based on the request in your solicitation document, fails to provide the satisfactory evidence of payment of taxes as you would have requested in those documents. But being mindful of Regulation 10, you go ahead, notwithstanding, and you award the contract to said supplier or contractor. So a couple of things are what we anticipate here. Your solicitation document must include the requirement of the supplier or contractor to either provide the evidence with its submission, or failing to do so, if that person is awarded the contract, then they are required to provide it within 6 months from the award. So you have to take the legislation and weave it now into your document. We are assisting in that regard, and we will share the document that we are creating with public bodies within the shortest possible time frame. So your document will speak to it. So you go ahead with your step 3 and you award the contract to the person, and you repeat in your award letter the fact that they have to comply with the regulation that says within 6 months of the award of contract, they must provide the public body with the documentary evidence, right? That's in your award letter. Step 5, having gone ahead and awarded and cautioned the supplier or contractor appropriately, you then immediately send an email to the OPR advising that the supplier or contractor has been granted this one-time waiver. Again, we will assist with a template, but the letter that, or the information that you send to the OPR will have, of course, the name of the supplier, as well as the date of the award and the expiry date of that 6 months. So all of that is done. The OPR gets your information and proceeds to develop the listing of these suppliers and contractors that are beneficiaries of the one-time waiver, and places it up. So if we get one name, we put that up. Then when we get a second name, we update, and so on. Once you get the notification from the supplier or contractor of having and they provide the documentary evidence now within that 6-month period, you go ahead and you advise the OPR again, and the OPR updates that register on its website. What you will want to be careful of as well going forward is you want to check on the OPR's website and go through the listing of those suppliers and contractors who would have been a beneficiary of the one-time waiver, because you want to make sure as a public body that you do not go ahead and award a contract to someone who already benefited from the one-time waiver. Okay, so we need to work the system together very carefully, because we do want to mitigate the risk of the supplier or contractor trying to benefit from the one-time waiver from a number of public bodies. Yes, so that's what we have so far. Again, any feedback that you wish to provide will be fine, but what we are seeking to do is to comply with the requirements of the legislation or the regulations as we have them here.
Thank you, Ms. Brown. Where a supplier or contractor may be awarded separate contracts for a single line of business as the need arises in cases of unplanned activities, do we apply the $75,000 limit per contract or per fiscal year?
The limit is not to the award of contract to the supplier or contractor. The limit has to do with the estimation of the procurement activity. And because our planning is annual, you have to say, okay, for the year, I will be spending $50,000 in stationery or $500,000 in stationery. It is what you estimate your procurement need to be for the year, or in the case of multi-year contracts, like maybe a framework agreement, what you estimate the value of the procurement to be over the 1 year, 2 years, or 3-year period. So it doesn't really, it isn't directly linked to the value of award to the supplier or any aggregate that he might be awarded over any period of time at all, or under different UNSP codes, right? It has to do with, for this particular item, this is my estimate spend for the contract.
So there's a question, please explain why the small scale has a wide range from 75,000 to 1 million. I don't know that there is what we wanted to do initially when we went forward with this proposal, the range was even wider, right? Because we want to ensure that if you give people flexibility to the extent that we are given under the micro procurements, that it is properly managed. And we will be looking at the micro procurement activities from this fiscal quarter to see how it is being used, and indeed whether there seems to be some difficulty in understanding the proper way of using it. When we looked at the little bit of data that we have, we are seeing that a significant amount of procurement activities in the public domain take about $1 million. So you have several activities, procurement activities that are in and around $1 million. And therefore, we wanted to balance in that with giving the greater flexibility with micro procurements. We wanted to ensure that those procurements are able to progress with greater efficiency. I can't say that there's any, robust reason. I mean, it was a negotiation that took place based on circumstances that were pointed out to us that's happening in public procurement in that arena, and really wanting to give that relief and giving the system that boost so that it could take off, rather than being, what happened after full proclamation is that there were many public bodies that froze and didn't know what to do. And in the process of that happening, the development objectives associated with public procurement were significantly stymied because they were not taking place in the time that was planned, and it was not taking place very efficiently. So that's really a good question. I'll have to consider more in terms of an appropriate response. But I tried to put together all that influenced how we went forward. And then of course we looked at international experience, and we did look at in other jurisdictions what applies there. There are in the UN system, they do have something that is called micro procurements, and I think it is about $10,000 US, one of them. Yeah, something to that effect. So different jurisdictions, different organizations have different kinds of limits. But of course, in establishing our limits, it had to be in our particular context and what it is we were trying to achieve. If an organization has an old purchase order that needs to be redone, and the purchase order was done before the legislation, how should this be treated? I would imagine that the old one was done prior to a full proclamation. I think that is something that your finance department and procurement departments will have to deliberate on the specific circumstances, and how is it that and why it needs to be redone, and whether in fact the project is deemed to be still open, or whether it has, or is it that you're revisiting the project? So there's a lot of dynamics there that you would need to have fuller information in order to even proffer a response. The UN has actually 5,000 US dollars. And there are other jurisdictions that have a very tiered approach to house. So we just thought that this was applicable, and we are now starting a system, right? As we look at and see how it's progressing over the next year, if there is need for change, if there's need for maybe some refinement, certainly the OPR will revisit it and make the appropriate recommendation based on what the data is telling us. If a public body has an ERP system such as SAP S/4HANA, which captures all the data required for the registry for micro-procurement, is another registry manual and or electronic still required? Well, I would say if that is working efficiently, and when you look at the guidelines that will be issued by the OPR, if you are in alignment with that, by all means, you could continue. Even if you are not in an alignment, I would urge you to reach out to the OPR so that we could see what you have. Maybe then, that will help us in how we advise other public bodies based on the fact that you have a system that is already operating. So, yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much to the OPR team for taking all of the questions and answering them accordingly. Thank you, stakeholders, for indulging us, giving us the opportunity to answer your questions. All right. Before I close.
Yeah, I just wanted to, before you close, Ms. Roy, I wanted to take the opportunity, since we have so many public bodies and representatives of public bodies in attendance, to urge you to pay some attention to your reporting, your statutory obligation to report on your procurement activities to the OPR. In the past year, since full proclamation, the showing has been very dismal in terms of reporting. At this point in time, we have just about 50% of our public bodies, of the 232 public bodies that are on the procurement depository, reporting, making an attempt to report. And the OPR has been working with them to bring their submissions up to the standard where we are able to report on the procurement activities with confidence in the data that we are collecting. But there are several public bodies and large public bodies that have not reported for any of the reporting periods that comprise the last year. And as the OPR is now in the final stages of preparing its report to the Parliament, and you will be identified, unfortunately, as having not complied with the law. So I would urge you to please remedy that situation as we approach the reporting for the third quarter of fiscal 2024, so that when we give a full fiscal year report, that at least we would show some activity on your parts for the 2 quarters. It is extremely difficult for the OPR to be given extensions of timelines for delivery of for submission of your reports. I mean, it's stated it's 3 weeks after the end of the quarter, you're required to submit your report. And we have in good faith at times given public bodies the opportunity, a little extension, and they have not even met those extensions. So come the third quarter, the quarter that we are in that is ending, the OPRO will not be granting any extensions to the 3 weeks after the end of quarter to receive your submission. So I pass you back on to Ms. Roy.
Thank you so much, Ms. Khan. So I just want to let you know that we will be sending today's presentation and a simplified procurement reference guide, as well as the recording of this session to your email for your ease of reference. We will also be preparing FAQs arising out of this session, and these will be placed on our website. You will be notified when this happens. So without further delay, we thank you so much again for joining us. You may submit any further questions to us at feedback@opr.org.tt. Do enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And once again, thank you from the OPR team.